Will you be working with him at that time?
No, I think we should have finished the film by then. I'll be working with him from March through the end of June or something like that.
Do you ever stop working?
Oh, God, yes. I sometimes don't do a picture for a year and a half.
It began with dust. Thick, golden dust swirling through the beams of an old storage room light. A room that hadn't been opened in decades. Inside a faded chest once belonging to Burt Lancaster, tucked beneath yellowing film scripts and worn leather gloves, a black notebook was found. Small, unmarked, almost ordinary. But when its pages were turned, the air seemed to change. Each entry was written in Lancaster's firm, deliberate handwriting, his words like quiet thunder. It wasn't a journal of memories or nostalgia. It was a list. 14 names. 14 legends. And beside each one, a story that made even the most hardened Hollywood historian pause in disbelief. Lancaster titled it simply, The Malicious Ones. When Hollywood Truth magazine got hold of it in March 2007, no one believed it was real. Editors assumed it was another forgery, one of the many lost diaries that surface whenever nostalgia and scandal collide. But after handwriting verification, cross-references to private correspondences, and confirmation from the Lancaster estate, the impossible became undeniable. The notebook was authentic, and its contents were venomous. For years, Burt Lancaster had been one of the golden pillars of old Hollywood, a man of discipline, intelligence, and raw magnetism. From here to eternity to Elmer Gantry, he embodied moral conflict and quiet rebellion. Fans saw him as the noble rebel, the man who fought for justice, both on-screen and off. Yet behind that legacy, hidden from the public, Lancaster had been taking notes. Painstaking, meticulous notes about the people he believed poisoned the very heart of the film industry. In his words, Hollywood doesn't breed stars. It breeds predators and then crowns them kings. First time the notebook's excerpts were printed, the reaction was explosive. Headlines screamed betrayal. Critics called it the dirtiest resurrection in film history. And fans who grew up worshipping these icons, were left grappling with disbelief. Could the heroes of cinema's golden age truly be villains in disguise? Lancaster's writings didn't read like gossip. They were too precise, too coldly factual. He documented tantrums, threats, addictions, manipulation, the dark machinery that made the dream factory run. He didn't exempt himself either. In one note, he called his own silence a crime of comfort. He admitted he'd turned away from the truth for years, too afraid of the cost of speaking. Something had changed in him during his final years. After surviving strokes and confronting his mortality, Lancaster grew more candid, more haunted. Friends recalled him talking about unfinished confessions, about a sickness that the industry feeds. No one knew he meant to document it until that notebook surfaced. Revelations struck like lightning. His first target, Elizabeth Taylor, whom he described not as a goddess of beauty, but as a storm of vanity and cruelty. Then Kirk Douglas, whom he called a predator in human skin. Each story revealed not just moral failure, but an entire system that rewarded darkness. Lancaster seemed to suggest that Hollywood's glamour was a carefully woven illusion, one built over graves of broken spirits. Why did he keep this list? Was it revenge? A moral reckoning? Or a confession from a man burdened by guilt? Theories multiplied. Some believed Lancaster intended to publish it before his death, a last crusade to expose Hollywood's sins. Others thought it was simply therapy, the private venting of a man who had witnessed too much. Yet what truly disturbed readers wasn't the existence of the list. It was the tone, not angry, not hysterical, but eerily calm. He described monstrous behavior with the detachment of a coroner describing a body. They smile for the cameras, one-page read, but behind that smile is rot. In a world built on image, that kind of truth was dangerous. Studios scrambled to control the fallout. Publicists denied everything. Some celebrities, estates threatened lawsuits, while others stayed silent, a silence that said more than words ever could. Historians debated whether Lancaster's notebook should even be published, fearing it would rewrite the myth of Hollywood itself. The damage was already done. The world had seen behind the curtain. The golden glow of the silver screen now flickered under the harsh light of betrayal. Through those pages, Lancaster didn't just accuse, he revealed a pattern. A culture that celebrated cruelty as charisma, exploitation as ambition, and manipulation as talent. He saw through the mirage, and what he saw broke him. He ended one entry with chilling simplicity. Fame is not light, it is fire, and we were all too eager to burn. N.T. Ho's words echoed like a warning to every actor, every dreamer, every fan who had ever fallen in love with a movie star's face. The discovery of that notebook didn't just tarnish reputations, it reopened a question Hollywood had buried for decades. What happens when the people who sell dreams are themselves living nightmares? For the first time, the film industry's carefully curated mythology cracked. The public began to wonder how many secrets still lay hidden, locked in drawers or buried with their keepers. If Burt Lancaster's confessions were only one man's truth, what would happen if others had written theirs too? And perhaps that was his intention all along, not vengeance, but revelation. A final act of honesty from a man who spent his life pretending. Was the magazine's final issue on the subject put it. Burt Lancaster didn't just leave behind a legacy of cinema. He left behind a mirror and dared Hollywood to look into it. NTHAT mirror reflected something no one wanted to see, that the brightest stars of the silver screen had cast the darkest shadows of them all. To the world, Elizabeth Taylor was the embodiment of Hollywood royalty, the violet-eyed beauty who conquered the silver screen with her timeless allure. She wasn't just a movie star. She was an institution, a woman whose very presence could silence rooms and stop clocks. But in Burt Lancaster's secret notebook, she wasn't a goddess. She was a storm, dazzling, dangerous, and merciless to anyone caught in her path. Lancaster's entry on Taylor began with a single haunting line, and she didn't just act in front of the camera, she acted in life. And she always made sure she won the scene. NHE described how, behind that angelic face and mesmerizing gaze, lived a woman who learned early that beauty was her greatest weapon. Taylor had been molded by the industry since childhood, taught to smile when she wanted to scream, to cry when she wanted to run. But somewhere along the way, that mask fused to her skin. The line between performance and reality vanished, and what emerged, Lancaster claimed, was a master manipulator who used chaos as control. Non-film sets, Taylor's presence was both a blessing and a curse. Directors adored her magnetism, but feared her wrath. Lancaster recalled stories from Cleopatra's chaotic production, where millions of dollars bled away under her unpredictable moods. One afternoon, she allegedly halted filming because a co-star received a better chair on set. Another day, she threw a glass of wine at her director, screaming that he didn't understand royalty. NTO her colleagues, she was a paradox, enchanting yet cruel, fragile yet ferociously dominant. Lancaster's notes painted her not as the victim of fame, but as one of its architects. He wrote that Taylor had discovered the sweet taste of control early in her career and wielded it like a sword. Even her most passionate relationships, he suggested, were crafted performances, grand spectacles designed not for love, but for power. Her marriages, especially to Richard Burton, were less romantic unions and more high-voltage power struggles, played out on the world stage for applause and sympathy. They didn't love each other, Lancaster wrote. They devoured each other. And Hollywood couldn't look away. NHE described a private encounter in the 1960s during a Hollywood dinner where both Lancaster and Taylor were guests. The evening began with laughter and champagne but ended with Taylor storming out, leaving a shattered glass on the floor and a producer trembling in silence. When Lancaster asked what had happened, the producer whispered, "She found out someone else was the center of attention." NTO Lancaster, that was the essence of her, a woman who could not survive without dominance. He saw in her eyes not sadness, but hunger. She wasn't chasing love, he wrote. She was chasing control over men, over fame, over the very narrative of her life. Yet his notes didn't read with hatred. There was a tone of pity buried between the lines. Lancaster, himself a man who knew the pressures of stardom, seemed to recognize in Taylor a kind of tragic self-destruction, the curse of someone who believed her worth depended on the chaos she caused. He wrote, she ruled through fear, but feared herself most of all. In the 1970s, as her fame began to fade, Taylor clung tighter to the power she once wielded effortlessly. Lancaster's writings described her desperate attempts to remain relevant, the marriages, the scandals, the calculated appearances. To the public, she was the ultimate survivor. But to Lancaster, she was a prisoner of her own myth. NHE recounted a moment during an awards ceremony where Taylor, dressed in diamonds that could blind a man, whispered to a friend, "If they stop looking, I disappear." That single sentence haunted Lancaster. It was, to him, the confession of a woman consumed by her own legend, a queen terrified of losing her throne. NBUT. Perhaps the most chilling passage in Lancaster's notebook was this, N. She could make you love her and hate her in the same breath. That was her genius, and her curse. The world saw her tears and thought they were real, but I've seen her cry without a drop of pain in her eyes. NHE wasn't alone in this view. Numerous directors and co-stars, quoted anonymously in old industry circles, echoed similar experiences. One assistant director once said, "Elizabeth didn't just perform. She manipulated the entire emotional weather of a set. If she was happy, the sun came out. If she was angry, everyone drowned." Lancaster believed this emotional control extended beyond the studio. In his notes, he wrote that Taylor mastered the press like a general masters an army. She leaked stories, staged reconciliations, and used heartbreak as a marketing strategy. Every scandal became a performance. Every headline, a calculated act in a lifelong drama. NBUT in one rare reflective line. Lancaster acknowledged the tragedy behind her cruelty. Hollywood made her, he wrote, but it also broke her before she knew what a normal life was. Every tantrum, every scream, it wasn't just arrogance. It was pain trying to be heard through applause. NTHAT complexity. The blend of victim and villain made Elizabeth Taylor one of the most enigmatic figures in Lancaster's notebook. She wasn't just a cautionary tale. She was the embodiment of Hollywood itself, seductive, ruthless, and eternally unsatisfied. When Hollywood Truth magazine published excerpts of this section, fans were outraged. Some called it blasphemy. Others whispered that maybe, just maybe, there was truth behind the glamour. After all, behind every iconic photograph of Taylor's radiant smile, there were whispers of broken friendships, destroyed marriages, and frightened colleagues who had witnessed her rage firsthand. In the end, Lancaster's portrayal wasn't about destroying her legacy. It was about revealing the price of worship. He ended his entry on Taylor with words that cut like a blade. And beauty without empathy is a weapon. She wielded hers until it turned back on her. N.T. Ho's violet eyes that once captivated the world now seemed to symbolize something else entirely. Not purity, but power. And through Lancaster's confessions, Elizabeth Taylor's legend took on a darker hue, shimmering not with glamour, but with the cold reflection of a woman who ruled Hollywood through chaos and paid for it with her soul. If Elizabeth Taylor was the storm that rattled Hollywood's calm facade, then Kirk Douglas was the predator that stalked beneath it. To the public, he was a titan, the bronze-skinned hero who embodied the American dream. From Spartacus to Paths of Glory, his fierce presence defined masculinity for an entire generation. But in Burt Lancaster's secret notebook, Douglas was stripped of his myth. No hero, no gladiator, just a man driven by domination, deceit, and a darkness that never left the screen because it lived inside him. Lancaster began Douglas's entry with a chilling sentence, N. He never stopped acting, not in front of the camera, not behind it, not even when he hurt people. NTHE too had worked together on several projects, most famously Gunfight at the OK Corral, where they shared equal billing but unequal influence. According to Lancaster's writings, Douglas didn't just crave attention, he demanded submission. He didn't want to be admired, Lancaster wrote, he wanted to be feared. Behind the gleaming smile and steel eyes, Douglas possessed a cruelty that made even powerful producers tread lightly. Lancaster described scenes where Douglas humiliated assistants, screamed at crew members for trivial mistakes, and made female co-stars cry, only to charm them again minutes later with honeyed apologies. He could twist emotions like a knife, Lancaster wrote. One moment he's your savior, the next he's your executioner. Hollywood insiders often whispered about Douglas's temper, but no one dared challenge him. He had friends in high places and a talent for disguising monstrosity as charisma. He wore kindness like a costume. Lancaster's note continued, and he never took it off until the lights were gone. NBUT, the darkness ran deeper than arrogance or temper. Lancaster hinted at something far more sinister, a predator hiding in plain sight. He wrote about nights that ended in fear and young women who disappeared from sets with tears in their eyes. Though he never named victims, the tone was unmistakable. Douglas wasn't merely difficult, he was dangerous. Lancaster, known for his moral intensity, struggled with this truth. In one chilling passage he admitted, "I watched him once, corner a girl half his age, and I said nothing. I told myself it wasn't my business. That was the day I lost my right to call myself decent." For years, Hollywood had turned a blind eye to such behavior. Power-shielded men like Douglas. Directors tolerated it for box office returns, agents covered it up for commissions, and victims were silenced with contracts and threats. He knew the system, Lancaster wrote, because he was the system. During the making of The Vikings in 1958, tensions between Lancaster and Douglas boiled over. Lancaster's notes recalled a brutal confrontation that nearly turned violent. "He came at me with that grin, the one he used before he humiliated someone. I told him I wasn't his servant, and he laughed. He said, 'Everyone is, Burt. You just don't know it yet.'" NTHAT sentence haunted Lancaster. To him, it summed up Douglas perfectly, a man who saw life as a hierarchy of domination. Every friendship, every partnership, every relationship was a game of control. He didn't love, Lancaster wrote, he conquered. Rumors of Douglas's predatory behavior lingered for decades. Actresses, assistants, and even fellow stars hinted at stories they couldn't tell aloud. Decades later, when silent accusations began to surface posthumously, Lancaster's notebook was re-examined as evidence that insiders had known the truth all along. In one of the most damning lines, Lancaster described Douglas's manipulation of the press then. He'd give a reporter a story, a scandal about someone else, just to keep them from looking too closely at him. He fed the wolves other people's flesh. NTHAT pattern of deflection, exposing others to protect himself, made Douglas untouchable for most of his career. His image as a fearless champion of justice, especially after producing Spartacus, made him appear noble. But Lancaster's account painted that act of rebellion against the Hollywood blacklist as nothing more than self-promotion. He didn't end the blacklist, Lancaster claimed. He ended a chapter he wasn't written into. Yet even Lancaster, hardened by years in the industry, seemed shaken by the darkness he described. "He was the only man who could look you in the eye while betraying you," he wrote. "And somehow, you still felt grateful for the attention. Behind that predator's charm was an emptiness, a void that success could never fill." Lancaster's words revealed a man addicted to domination, feeding off others, fear as proof of his power. He wrote, he wasn't satisfied until he broke something, a spirit, a reputation, a person. NBY. The time Douglas reached his later years, his reputation had been lacquered with honor and nostalgia. Hollywood celebrated him as one of its last surviving icons. Awards, retrospectives, and tributes framed him as the, quote, fighter for justice. But Lancaster's words, unearthed long after both men were gone, cracked that illusion wide open. He spent his life pretending to be the hero, Lancaster concluded, but every hero he played was a rehearsal for the man he wished the world believed he was. NTHE More 1 read, the clearer it became that Lancaster wasn't just chronicling another star's sins. He was indicting an entire era that allowed monsters to hide behind movie posters. He recognized that Douglas wasn't an anomaly. He was a product of a system that rewarded control and crushed vulnerability. In one passage, Lancaster confessed something that felt like guilt disguised as wisdom. "Men, I envied his power. I despised his soul. And the truth is, there were days I couldn't tell the difference between us." NTHAT line revealed something profound. Lancaster wasn't writing as a moral judge. He was writing as a witness, burdened by complicity. He had been part of the machine that made men like Douglas untouchable. By documenting it, he was trying, perhaps too late, to make peace with his silence. When Hollywood Truth magazine published this section, the backlash was immediate. Fans were furious. Defenders called it fiction, and some media outlets refused to reprint the accusations. But among the old insiders, there was no outrage. Only quiet acknowledgement. They knew. They had always known. Lancaster's notebook forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth, that beneath Hollywood's golden glow lurked predators dressed as pioneers. That for every dream sold to the audience, a nightmare was lived behind the scenes. NHE ended Douglas's chapter with the starkest words in the entire notebook. Some stars burn bright. Others burn through people. And with that, the legend of Kirk Douglas, Hollywood's immortal hero, became something else entirely. A warning etched in ink by a man who had seen what true darkness looked like and dared at last to write it down. If Elizabeth Taylor was the storm and Kirk Douglas the predator, then Natalie Wood was the illusion, the perfect porcelain doll painted with tragedy. To the public, she was innocence personified. A woman who cried beautifully on screen, who seemed fragile, pure, and heartbreakingly human. But to Burt Lancaster, she was something entirely different. In his secret notebook, under her name, he wrote only one short line before the pages spilled into accusation. She never cried for real, not once. N.T. Ho's words, cold and merciless, became the opening to what many later called the most shocking section of Lancaster's confessions. Natalie Wood, the beloved star of Rebel Without a Cause and West Side Story, wasn't just an actress to him. She was a manipulator who turned vulnerability into a weapon, a master illusionist who could summon sympathy, tears, and chaos at will. Lancaster described watching her on set once in the 1950s, a fragile girl surrounded by adoring men, every one of them convinced she needed saving. They all thought she was lost, he wrote, but she was leading them. NHER method was simple but devastatingly effective. She played the victim until she controlled the room. If she didn't get her way, she fainted. If a director refused her demands, she wept until guilt broke him down. Lancaster claimed she would show up late, unprepared, then crumble into trembling apologies that melted any anger. It was theater, he wrote. She didn't act for the camera. She acted for life. Hollywood adored her for it. To the press, she was the broken angel, the child star who grew up too fast, the woman haunted by love and fame. But Lancaster's account stripped that legend bare. He claimed she learned manipulation as survival. From her teenage years, she understood that power in Hollywood didn't come from strength. It came from fragility. She made weakness her weapon, he wrote, and everyone who tried to save her became her servant. Lancaster's words grew darker when he recalled how her manipulation extended beyond sets, into friendships, marriages, even tragedies. She could make people fall in love with her misery, he said. She used pain like a stage light, bright enough to blind anyone looking too closely. One particular story, whispered in Hollywood circles but never confirmed, found new weight through Lancaster's account. During the filming of Splendor in the Grass, Wood allegedly clashed violently with director Elia Kazan. She would show up sobbing, refusing to perform, claiming he'd broken her spirit. Yet Lancaster wrote that she later bragged privately about how those breakdowns had earned her sympathy. and eventually an Oscar nomination. She didn't need therapy, he wrote. She needed an audience. Burt Lancaster's tone shifted midway through his entry. Beneath the anger was something else. Sorrow, almost pity. He understood that Wood's manipulation was born from terror, not malice. She was raised in fear. He wrote, referring to her mother Maria Gurdon, a controlling woman notorious for pushing Natalie into fame before she could walk. Her mother taught her that love and attention were currency, that if the spotlight moved, so would affection. NSO Natalie learned to never let it move. She perfected the art of keeping eyes on her, through tears, through scandal, through pain. She turned her trauma into theater, Lancaster wrote, and Hollywood applauded every act. NHER relationships followed the same tragic rhythm. With Robert Wagner, the man she married twice, Lancaster described a union that was less about love and more about control. They mirrored each other's insecurities, he wrote. They didn't heal each other. They fed each other's need to be adored. Their marriage, glittering to outsiders, was a war zone behind closed doors. Lancaster's notes suggested that both used jealousy as a form of power. Wagner, possessive and volatile. Wood, calculating and emotional. They loved with knives in their hands, Lancaster wrote. Every kiss had an edge. Then came the night that sealed her legend, November 29, 1981. Natalie Wood's lifeless body was found floating near Catalina Island. The official story said she drowned after falling from a yacht. But whispers never stopped. There were arguments, alcohol, a fight with Wagner, and unanswered questions that turned her death into Hollywood's most haunting mystery. Lancaster's notebook didn't claim to know what happened that night, but he offered an unsettling reflection. No. Her whole life was performance. She lived in make-believe so long that even death had to come like a scene, dramatic, mysterious, and unfinished. NHE didn't write with cruelty, but with eerie certainty. To him, Natalie Wood's tragedy wasn't her drowning. It was that no one ever knew who she truly was. The tears, the charm, the fear, all of it was armor. He wrote, "Behind it, I don't think there was anything left but exhaustion. Hollywood mourned her as its lost angel. Directors, co-stars, and fans spoke of her with reverence, as though she were a saint of cinema." But Lancaster's words forced readers to reconsider. Was she a victim of the system or one of its quiet architects? NHE ended her section with the most haunting passage in the entire notebook, N. She died surrounded by men she once controlled. They wept for her, but if she had lived, she would have found a way to make them weep again. When Hollywood Truth magazine published those words, outrage erupted. Critics called it character assassination. Fans accused the magazine of desecrating a dead woman's memory. But among the few insiders who knew Lancaster personally, silence prevailed. Because they had seen it too, the tears that came too easily, the manipulation wrapped in beauty, yet even Lancaster seemed to wrestle with his own guilt. He had admired her once, perhaps even cared for her. In one line, almost buried in the margins, he confessed, "I wanted to save her until I realized she didn't want to be saved. She wanted to be seen." NTHAT, one sentence encapsulated the tragedy of Natalie Wood. Not evil, not innocence, but something far sadder. A woman so addicted to attention that she became her own invention. In the end, Lancaster didn't damn her. He exposed her. He showed how Hollywood devours its fragile, how a little girl raised to perform can grow into a woman who no longer knows where the performance ends. NHE wrote, almost like a eulogy. And Natalie was a reflection of us all. The industry that rewards heartbreak, the audience that worships tears, and the woman who believed she could cry her way to love. She fooled everyone. And that was her greatest performance. In those words, the fragile beauty of Natalie Wood shattered, revealing not a victim or villain, but a mirror of Hollywood itself. Brilliant, deceptive, and tragically hollow beneath the glow. By the time the last pages of Burt Lancaster's secret notebook were revealed, the tone had shifted entirely. The bitterness, the scandal, the venom, all gave way to something quieter, almost poetic. It was as though, after dissecting the souls of others, Lancaster had finally turned the blade inward. What remained wasn't anger, but revelation. A confession not about individuals, but about the entire illusion that fed them all. Hollywood, he began, was never a place. It was a pact, a covenant written in charm and lies, and we all signed it in blood. N.T. Ho's words would later be printed in red ink on the cover of Hollywood Truth magazine. They summed up the heart of Lancaster's secret writings, a truth so many suspected, but none had dared articulate so boldly. For decades, Lancaster had been the quintessential Hollywood titan, the muscle-bound hero, the face of moral strength. Yet, in his own pages, he dismantled that image. He confessed that the industry he helped build wasn't just corrupt, it was designed to corrupt. "The studio lights don't just shine," he wrote. "They burn. They melt who you were until nothing is left but what they can sell." NHE recounted how actors, directors, and even journalists became willing participants in this silent exchange. Careers weren't built on talent alone. They were built on obedience, secrets, and image. "The truth wasn't banned," Lancaster wrote. "It was bought." And according to his account, there existed an unspoken agreement, a blood pact of sorts, between stars, studios, and the media. Every rumor buried, every scandal silenced, was part of the deal. "You protect the illusion, and the illusion protects you," he wrote. "Break that rule and you vanish." It wasn't paranoia. In those final pages, Lancaster listed names not of lovers or rivals this time, but of those who had disappeared after defying the unspoken code. Actors whose careers evaporated overnight, producers who fell from grace, reporters who dared to print what they weren't supposed to. NHE told of one actress, unnamed, who had uncovered the truth about studio-run affairs and hidden pregnancies. She'd threatened to expose it all. Within a month, her contracts were canceled, her reputation smeared with fabricated stories of mental instability. Lancaster's handwriting trembled as he described it. She wasn't crazy. She was inconvenient. NTO Lancaster. That was the real Hollywood horror story. Not the scandals that made headlines, but the machinery that buried the ones that could destroy it. And in that darkness, he found his own guilt staring back. "I laughed at the lies because I lived on them," he admitted. "I played heroes while watching villains get rich." NFOR the first time, his entries spoke not of others' sins, but his own complicity. He detailed how he'd turned a blind eye to what he called quiet crimes. The grooming of young actors, the manipulation of careers, the cover-ups of addiction and abuse. "We made monsters look like stars," he wrote. "We called it glamour." NHE described studio executives as priests of illusion, men who offered fame as salvation, but demanded worship in return. And the actors? "We were the congregation," he said, too afraid to stop singing hymns we didn't believe in. There was one passage that shook readers to the core when it was finally published, a metaphor that sounded less like literature and more like confession. "And every Oscar on a shelf is a gravestone for the truth that died so it could exist. Every standing ovation is a funeral for honesty. Hollywood doesn't create stars. It manufactures angels out of devils, and then weeps when the wings fall off." NBUT buried beneath the bitterness was something almost spiritual, an understanding that the system had consumed not just others, but him as well. "I am not the judge," he wrote in one of his final entries. "I was a willing sinner." NHE recalled the loneliness of fame, how adoration felt like a drug, and how easily it replaced real love. "They cheered for me," he confessed, "but they never knew me. Maybe that's why I never wanted them to." Lancaster described watching younger actors fall into the same traps he had, the desperation to stay relevant, the fear of being forgotten. "They come to this town believing they'll make history," he wrote. "But history doesn't exist here, only headlines. and in one haunting anecdote he wrote about standing on a movie set, surrounded by adoring crew members, cameras flashing, and yet feeling like a ghost inside his own legend. It was there he claimed to have realized that Hollywood didn't just sell dreams, it sold identities. "We become strangers to ourselves," he wrote. "And by the time we notice, it's too late." NBUT. The most chilling part of Lancaster's notebook came near the end, where he claimed that some of the greatest Hollywood tragedies weren't accidents at all. The drowning, the overdoses, the car crashes, some of them were the industry's way of cleaning up its mess, he alleged. "It's easier to mourn a martyr than explain a cover-up." NTHAT lines sent shockwaves through the public. Did Lancaster know more about Natalie Wood's death? About Marilyn's? About the countless accidents that had riddled Hollywood history? He never said outright, but the implication was there. Thick, poisonous, undeniable. NTHE notebook ended with a page written in shaky, almost illegible handwriting. It read, "N. The lies made us legends. The truth would have made us human. NBUT in Hollywood. Humanity doesn't sell." When those final words hit the press, Hollywood panicked. Studio lawyers moved to suppress publication. Former co-stars called it fiction, delusion, the ramblings of a bitter old man. But others, especially those who had seen too much, said nothing. Silence. The oldest code of the Blood Pact spoke louder than denial. In death, Burt Lancaster had done what few ever dared. He had broken the circle. He had confessed to being part of the machine, and in doing so, he made it tremble. NFOR the public. The revelations were intoxicating, a forbidden glimpse into the rot behind the red carpet. For Hollywood, it was a threat too dangerous to acknowledge, and yet even in his final act, Lancaster's words carried a strange, tragic beauty. He had spent his life pretending to be heroes, but in truth, his last act, writing those pages, was the only heroic thing he ever did. NHE closed his confession with a final, devastating reflection that could apply to every name, every scandal, every secret he had ever written about N. "We built our heaven out of lies, and we called it Hollywood." When Hollywood Truth magazine published the excerpts from Burt Lancaster's secret notebook in March 2007, the industry froze. For the first time in decades, the golden faces that once ruled the silver screen were stripped of their immortality. The story was a bomb dropped in the middle of a town that thrived on illusion, and the shockwaves were felt in every studio boardroom, gossip column, and film archive in Los Angeles. NTHE morning the article hit newsstands. Journalists crowded Sunset Boulevard like scavengers circling the carcass of a dying myth. The headline read in bold crimson letters, "Burt Lancaster's final revelation, the evil behind Hollywood's golden age." Below it, the teaser line sent shivers through the industry. 14 names, 14 nightmares. People didn't know what to believe. Some dismissed the notebook as an elaborate forgery, a cruel attempt to smear dead legends. But others, especially those who had worked behind the curtain, said nothing, because they knew silence was safer. Within hours, every name on Lancaster's list was trending worldwide. TV networks aired emergency panels. Film historians were summoned to debate authenticity, and psychologists analyzed the language of a dying man's regret. It wasn't just gossip. It was an autopsy of Hollywood's soul. NFOR, the first time, the public began to question what they had always worshipped. Could their idols, the flawless faces framed in gold, really have been monsters in disguise? And if so, what did that say about the entire foundation of fame? And among the most haunting reactions came from the families of those named. Elizabeth Taylor's representatives issued a furious denial, calling Lancaster's claims fiction from a fading mind. Yet, behind closed doors, her children reportedly demanded that certain personal documents be locked away indefinitely. NTHE family of Kirk Douglas responded with icy silence. At the time, the old star was still alive, frail and protected by layers of public relations experts. But insiders whispered that the revelations had reopened old wounds. particularly the rumors about Natalie Wood, whose name also appeared in Lancaster's notebook. Natalie's sister, Lana Wood, told a reporter off-record, "Burt wasn't wrong. He just said what no one else dared." Her words were quickly buried under legal threats, but they lingered like a ghost over every interview that followed. NTHE Studios, terrified of a scandal that could rewrite history, launched their own defense. Warner Brothers and MGM released carefully worded statements insisting Lancaster's notebook was a misrepresentation of the artistic community, but their tone betrayed fear. Archivists were ordered to restrict access to certain production files. Contracts from the 1950s vanished from digital databases overnight. It was as if Hollywood was trying to erase its own fingerprints. Meanwhile, the media, that same machinery Lancaster had accused of feeding lies, feasted on the chaos. Every talk show, every radio segment, every late-night monologue replayed snippets from the notebook, transforming Lancaster's confessions into a spectacle. Ironically, in exposing Hollywood's dark underbelly, he had given it its most profitable drama in years. NBUT Amid the Noise, a quieter storm brewed in academia. Historians began re-evaluating biographies and memoirs. Old interview tapes resurfaced, their meaning suddenly darker. When they revisited footage of Lucille Ball's tense moments with her staff, or Marilyn Monroe's cryptic interviews about being controlled, it all began to look different, less glamorous, more sinister. And then came the online age of conspiracy. Forums and blogs dedicated to old Hollywood exploded overnight. Users dissected every paragraph of Lancaster's notebook, comparing handwriting, cross-referencing dates, and posting proof that his stories matched hidden events. A new generation, one raised long after Lancaster's death, became obsessed with his words. To them, he wasn't a bitter relic. He was a whistleblower, decades ahead of his time. Still, there was one mystery that even experts couldn't solve. How had the notebook survived at all? The official story claimed it had been found in a private storage unit belonging to Lancaster's former assistant, uncovered after his death. But others whispered that the assistant had been silenced years earlier, and that what reached the magazine was only a fraction of what Lancaster had truly written. One journalist who reviewed the original pages described something chilling. There were red stains on the edges of some sheets, not ink. Like fingerprints that had bled through time. Whether metaphor or truth, the image captured the essence of what Lancaster's notebook represented. The blood that every Hollywood success was written in. The backlash was relentless. Actors, unions condemned the publication. Studio historians labeled it, quote, career assassination from the grave. But even as the industry tried to bury the scandal, the public couldn't look away. People wanted the truth, even if it meant dismantling the myths they had worshipped for generations. What emerged from that chaos was a collective realization. Hollywood wasn't a museum of saints. It was a graveyard of secrets. Every framed portrait, every golden trophy, every tearful acceptance speech suddenly seemed suspect. Lancaster's words had tainted nostalgia itself. Yet beyond the anger and denial, something unexpected happened. Empathy. For the first time, people began to see those glittering stars not as gods, but as broken, manipulated souls trapped in a system that devoured them. The cruelty wasn't just in the actions of the 14 names, it was in the machine that made them that way. In one interview, an aging director who had worked with Lancaster summed it up best. He didn't hate them. He pitied them. Burt saw what Hollywood did to good people. And maybe, in the end, he realized it had done the same to him. NTHAT single quote changed the tone of the public debate. Lancaster's notebook was no longer viewed solely as a weapon. It was a warning. A desperate message from a man who had lived inside the lie too long and wanted to free the next generation from it. And in the months that followed, Hollywood Truth magazine faced lawsuits, censorship, and even threats. But by then the damage was done. The myth had cracked. The gods had bled. Lancaster's words had finally done what decades of journalism couldn't. They made the world question the price of fame. And in that questioning, Hollywood's untouchable golden age, the dream that had defined an era, began to look less like a fairy tale and more like a beautiful burning illusion. Even years after the story broke, Burt Lancaster's secret notebook continued to cast a long and unsettling shadow over Hollywood. It wasn't just a scandal anymore. It was a haunting. Every few years, the notebook would resurface in documentaries, academic journals, or online exposés, each time dragging the industry back into the abyss it had tried to bury. NBY 2015, nearly a decade after the magazine's publication, new evidence began to surface, suggesting that the version released to the public wasn't complete. Former archivists hinted that entire chapters had been omitted, sections where Lancaster reportedly described the modern heirs of the same cruelty he'd seen decades before. The names weren't old legends this time. They were the contemporary faces of cinema and politics. The implication was clear. Hollywood hadn't changed. It had evolved, grown sleeker, more corporate, but the machinery of manipulation remained the same. Scholars studying the notebook noticed something chilling in Lancaster's tone. The first half of his writings were filled with fury, a man lashing out at the monsters around him, but the later pages were different. They read like a sermon. He wasn't just exposing individuals. He was trying to describe a pattern, a system that thrived on the same emotional currency: control, fear, and silence. The industry does not reform, he wrote in one passage. It rebrands its sins. NTHAT line would later become the motto of every YouTube exposé, every podcast investigating the dark side of fame. It summed up the entire paradox of Hollywood's legacy, that the same empire which sold dreams also manufactured nightmares. Critics accused Hollywood Truth magazine of sensationalism. They said Lancaster's words were exaggerated, filtered through bitterness. Yet, over the following years, story after story emerged, leaked recordings, memoirs, lawsuits, that seemed to echo the same themes: exploitation, abuse, and the quiet destruction of those who dared to resist. Suddenly, the once laughable notebook felt prophetic, and film students quoted it in essays about the psychology of fame. Journalists cited it during the #MeToo movement, drawing eerie parallels between Lancaster's 1950s observations and the scandals of the 2010s. He warned us, one writer noted, and we still didn't listen. NTHE notebook became a mirror, reflecting the same demons dressed in new clothes. The predators Lancaster wrote about were long dead, but their methods were alive in boardrooms, press junkets, and award ceremonies. Hollywood had simply learned to disguise its cruelty as empowerment. One of the most haunting analyses came from a biographer who'd spent decades researching Lancaster's life. She described how his last years were spent in quiet isolation, away from the studios that once celebrated him. He'd reportedly told a close friend, "They'll forgive anything but honesty." That friend later confirmed that the notebook was his form of rebellion, a final act of truth in a world addicted to lies. NTHE biographer found an unpublished note in his handwriting that wasn't part of the released pages. It read, N. One day they'll call this slander. Then they'll call it history. And in the end, they'll call it prophecy. NTHAT single line reframed everything. What had once been dismissed as the angry scribblings of a fading actor was now seen as a map, a record of how power perpetuates itself through fear. NBY 2020, Lancaster's secret notebook had achieved almost mythic status online. Entire YouTube channels, Reddit threads, and true crime podcasts were devoted to decoding it. Each fan believed there was something still hidden, a final truth between the lines. People compared his story to that of other Hollywood figures who'd tried to expose the system: Judy Garland, Montgomery Clift, Marlon Brando, all of whom paid a price for their honesty. One theory suggested that Lancaster knew he was being watched when he wrote it. Hidden within the pages, analysts claimed to find coded language, initials, and dates referring to scandals that hadn't yet occurred. Whether coincidence or foresight, it gave the notebook an almost supernatural aura, as though it wasn't just written about Hollywood, but against it. Meanwhile, the city itself seemed to tremble beneath its own ghosts. The once sacred icons of the Golden Age no longer felt untouchable. Biopics that once painted them as flawless heroes began to explore their flaws. Documentaries revealed the cost of the studio system, the pressure, the pills, the broken marriages, the institutional cruelty. Slowly, Hollywood began to do what Lancaster had begged it to: tell the truth. But even in truth-telling, there was irony. Every dark Hollywood documentary that aired was still a product, still monetized pain. The machine had learned to sell its own corruption back to the audience, proof that Lancaster's warning was eternal. Hollywood does not repent, he wrote. It reinvents its sins until they become art. NTHAT paradox, that beauty could be born of horror, became Lancaster's legacy. In his own strange way, he had done what none of his contemporaries dared. He forced the Dream Factory to confront its nightmares. And though it fought back, though it tried to silence him, time proved him right. Today, his name is spoken with both awe and unease. Film historians can't write about the Golden Age without mentioning The Notebook. It changed how people viewed not only the stars of the past, but the nature of fame itself. Burt Lancaster was no longer just a leading man. He was the conscience of an industry that never wanted one, and yet the more people studied him, the clearer his contradictions became. He was not innocent. He had participated in the very system he condemned. He had turned a blind eye when silence was convenient. He had accepted awards from the same studios he later called corrupt. Perhaps that was why his confession struck so deeply, because it came from someone who was both sinner and witness. In that sense, Lancaster's final act wasn't about revenge. It was redemption. He knew his legacy would fracture, that future generations would remember him not just for Elmer Gantry or From Here to Eternity, but for the truth he dared to write. In one of his most quoted lines, he wrote, "Note, I was made by the machine. I fed it, and when I saw what it was, I couldn't destroy it, only warn the next soul who walked into its light." NTHAT line now adorns the marble steps of the Hollywood Museum, engraved quietly near his portrait. A reluctant tribute to the man who exposed the cost of immortality. NTHE story doesn't end with him, though. Each year, another celebrity scandal unfolds, a headline about power, manipulation, or downfall, and somewhere in the comment sections, a familiar phrase appears again and again. Burt warned us. NHE has become more than a man. He is a ghost that still walks Hollywood, not to haunt it with fear, but with truth. The kind of truth that lingers when the cameras stop rolling, when the makeup fades, and when the applause turns into silence. NTHE Notebook was never about destroying reputations. It was about reclaiming something deeper, humanity, the kind that fame erases, that power corrupts, and that the world forgets in its hunger for beauty. Lancaster's final gift to the world was not a scandal. It was clarity. The courage to say that behind every perfect smile, there's a cost. Behind every star, a shadow. And perhaps that's why, nearly 2 decades later, his words still matter. Because as long as there's a stage, a camera, or a dream waiting to be sold, Hollywood will continue to write new lies. And somewhere, between the lines, the ghost of Burt Lancaster will still be whispering, "Nay, don't believe the light. Look for the shadow. That's where the truth lives."